WNYC-TV presents Barbara Lee Diamonstein and...
Avery Fisher has devoted his life to the distribution of music in one form or another. Is founder of a renowned high-fidelity equipment company that bears his name, as well as the chief benefactor of New York's Philharmonic Hall, which now also bears his name. He has used his resources to creatively enhance the cultural world. Thank you for that, Mr. Fisher, and thank you for joining us here today. You're one of those rare individuals who has transformed your avocation into your occupation. How did you become a pioneer in the high-fidelity equipment field?
Well, my first 10 years after college I spent as a graphics man, first in an agency that specialized in book publishing accounts, and then...
You mean a graphics designer? As a graphics designer.
And when they got into trouble in 1933, you're too young to remember this, but the banks closed, and they literally went out of business almost. And then at that point, I was out of a job for some months, and in September, I joined Dodd Mead and Company Book Publishers, and I stayed there for 10 years as a book designer. But starting in 1937, I developed my own hobby of the high-quality reproduction of records and radio, and built sets for my own pleasure, which, of course, were heard by friends of mine, and they wanted duplicates. I started making duplicates, and after a few
Manually?
Yes, and after a few years, it grew into what became Fisher Radio eventually.
And this was founded in 1937?
1937 is when I started. I still stayed on at Dodd Mead and Company. This was a moonlighting proposition for 6 years. That's how I spent my nights, not my days.
And when did
Daytime, I was a book designer.
When did you become a full-time sound equipment person?
In 1943, I left Dodd Mead and Company to devote my full time to my electronic manufacturing operation. And
was that in any way involved with the military at that time?
Yes, indeed. As a matter of fact, by that time we had worked up a very fine engineering staff, and I should tell you something of which I'm very proud. The first instrument landing system at LaGuardia Airport was designed and built by my company for the Civil Aeronautics Administration.
Well, your interest in sound obviously stems from your earliest familial experiences. From what I gather, the Fisher family was a very musical family, in fact, sufficiently so that a string quartet could be rounded out without calling in any outsiders. What is your instrument, and how frequently did you play?
Well, violin is my instrument, and I should tell you that I was the only violinist in the family. The others were pianists. And it was not until 1934 that, well, first of all, I did study with some very fine people. My last violin teacher, before I had to quit going to college, was Sam Franco. And he, in his turn, had been the pupil of Vieuxtemps and Joachim, who were two of the great violinists of the 19th century. From there, starting in 1934, and long after I'd got out of college and was working, I decided that we were going to have quartets in my home, and so I organized an amateur string quartet group. That group stayed together for many, many years. We met every Friday night, winter and summer, went right through the repertoire for our own pleasure and edification. We weren't rehearsing for performance or anything like that. And that experience, I would say, is the single greatest musical experience of my life. Now, we still have string quartets in my home about once a month.
And you play with chamber music groups as well? I
do not play anymore because the people who come to play won't have me. I'm talking now about the best people from Marlborough, the chamber music side, people like Jamie Laredo. And I'm now reduced to the function of librarian. And I must tell you, I'm a very good librarian.
And what do you do in that capacity?
That capacity, I'll hand out the parts, sit down and enjoy the music.
Oh, the programs.
That's it. And I help make up the programs, of course.
Do you think that musical ability is genetically transmitted? One of the few things that can be traced to a genetic transmission, inner ear and things of that sort?
I go much further than that. I say that skills, personality traits, an unbelievable depth of components that make up a human being are inherited. There's no question about it. I see it in my own family. I see it in great ways. My designing skills, for example, have passed on to my 3 children, and particularly my younger daughter, Nancy, who has done marvelous work in ceramics and is now onto her own career.
Do you think that is role model or environment rather than genetics?
I don't think so. Oh, no. The skills are there. There's no question about it. But I'm talking about the most minute detail. As you can see, I have a left eyebrow in which 6 hairs grow in the wrong direction. My mother had this genetic defect, which it is really, and you consider the millions of hairs on the body. This characteristic has been passed on to my 3 children. Those same 6 hairs. Now, if you can pass on that kind of information, anything can be passed on. I've seen similarities in handwriting between one of my daughters and my sister, her aunt. It's incredible. That's a long answer to your question.
I wonder, though, if you would address it specifically, though, to musical ability because of the nature of the inner ear and the ability to reproduce sound.
Well, I think there are 2 components there. First, I think it is an inherited characteristic, but if there has been a musical parent around, it's more likely that the child will be given an opportunity to develop whatever skills the child has in the form of music. And that's true of anything the parent does well. He will continue to do those things, and it will rub off on the children.
You've been the donor, as we all know, of a major gift to Lincoln Center. 20% of the income from that Avery Fisher Endowment is reserved for the support of the Avery Fisher Artists Program. What opportunity does that provide for young people? And who decides, and by what standard?
Well, it begins out in the field, where we have over 150 members of what we call a recommendation board. And the people in the field could be heads of music schools, could be conductors, could be great artists like Isaac Stern, who have their eyes open for the young talent, that flash, in the darkness. And they will send in the names of these people they think are worthy of consideration. And those names are submitted to an executive committee at Lincoln Center, which is actually the executive committee of the Avery Fisher Artist Award Program. And we have Zubin Mehta on that. We have John Mazzola, who's president of the center. We have Bill Lockwood, who's a programming director. We have Mark Schubart, who's the head of it. We have Charles Wadsworth, who is the artistic director of the Chamber Music Society at Lincoln Center. So all the people who are responsible for what we call Lincoln Center on the artistic level, and one administrator, those are the people who select the final awardee. Now the reward means appearances with the New York Philharmonic, with the Chamber Music Society, possibly the Mostly Mozart series, the Great Performance series, and with other musical organizations throughout the United States.
They have the opportunity to play with...
This launches these youngsters onto a major career.
Are there any examples of persons who have been well launched?
Yes, of course. The very first choices were Murray Pariah, who's gone on to an international career, Lynn Harrow, cellist. All the way down the line, we have people of that quality and caliber.
Well, talk about decision-making. I wondered if you can tell us how after, I guess it was about 14 years of acoustical trouble, that Philharmonic Hall had experienced, in addition to being redone in part several times, how and under what circumstances was the difficult decision made to do it just one more time?
Well, it was not a difficult decision.
Apparently only to you, as I recall reading. You were the one who felt most confident.
If you watch the surgeon pick up a scalpel, he doesn't stand there wondering, should I or shouldn't I? he cuts right away. He knows what he's going to do. He knows what he expects to find there, and he moves. You have to remember that I have spent the major part of my life in sound and in acoustics on two levels. First, as a performer, I started by taking lessons for years with great teachers. I played in my school orchestras. I played string quartets for many, many years, so I was in there. I know what the instruments sound like. On top of that, I ran the leading firm in the manufacture of reproducing equipment, so that people in their homes could put on a record or listen to a broadcast and enjoy music in their home as nearly like the original as possible. Now that all boils down to a sense of musical judgment. I think I have it. First, from the training and exposure, and second, from the gift of my particular kind of hearing, which I think is somewhat above average. It had to be for me to succeed in the business in which I was, against the giant companies, you see.
By the way, how do you compare that experience of sitting in a concert hall, in a symphony hall, and listening to music versus the experience of listening to music at home?
In the home? Well, there's an emotional component when you are in the presence of other people like yourself who have gathered, who dropped everything else to come to one place.
The chemistry
to hear,
of the live
that's
performance.
right, to hear a live performance. There's that you cannot bring into the home, no matter how fine the equipment. No, but on the other hand, there are those of us who like certain types of music. We want to be able to hear that music when we have the time to listen to it, and according to our own taste, you see.
Apparently, the term to be avoided is a perfect hall. But how at long last did you get this Philharmonic Hall of acoustical excellence?
Well, you see, it is the practice of acousticians, and I don't think they mean any harm by it, of leading the public into thinking that it's a bit of black magic, you know. But that's not true. The laws of nature are beyond the changing by any human being. They are immutable. The laws of physics, the laws of acoustics. If you work with those laws, you come out with a successful hall. If you work against them, you're in trouble. There are three major components, and if you follow these religiously, you come out with a successful hall. First of all, let me qualify that. If you have a hall that seats under 1,000 people, it's not all that much of a problem. When you approach 3,000 people, as you do.
How many does Avery Fisher
Just under
Hall?
3,000, 2,700, something like that. When you get into that dimension, you've got to be careful. So here are the three components.
In their classical interpretations, is that it? That there's a particular shape of a hall?
Well, the shape should be within reasonable, shall we say, parameters. You can't build an ellipse and have a successful hall.
Please come back to the three components.
Well,
I'm sorry.
well, let me give you a foundation there briefly. A concert hall is nothing but an acoustical billiard table. The sound that's generated on that stage should swill around until it loses its energy and be enjoyed and savored by the people who are there for that purpose. You need three components for a successful hall. You need containment. You have to have a hall in which the sound that's generated on the stage stays in that hall, doesn't leak out through a porous ceiling or through open doors or through an air conditioning system. Then you need scatter, you need irregular surfaces, you need random width panels, statuary, and irregularly shaped edging on the front balcony, on the balcony, shall we say, on the fronts of the balconies, to scatter the sound so that no matter where you sit in the hall, you enjoy the same concert, not dead spot, hot spot. And finally, exclusion. You don't want to hear fire engines going by outside. You don't want to hear the subway rumbling by, you know, under your feet. And you don't want to hear people out in the lobby mumbling because they were late, they're missing the first number. You don't want to hear the air from the air conditioning system whooshing in there. You want absolute silence. And that way, even a muted note on a violin can be heard all over that hall. And that's true, incidentally, now at Lincoln Center. It didn't used to be.
How much of the design was dictated by sound considerations? For example, those gold log-like convex
That's scatter.
surfaces.
That's the scatter component. Now, if you
This is
know-
in the front of the boxes.
That's right. That's to just divert the sound so it doesn't focus on anything. And you'll notice the ceiling is sawtooth, so it has reflective
Irregular.
surfaces. Right. Scattering, literally splashing the sound in every direction in that hall. Doesn't matter where you sit, you'll hear the same concert.
So among those components, would wood and plaster be very important?
Wood is a very desirable material. Plaster is an excellent material. That plaster ceiling, I think, is about 1 3/4 inches thick. Nothing gets through there. In the old hall, they had a catwalk on top, and you could walk up there and hear the concert just as well as though you were inside the hall. So that all of that energy went up there and never came back again. That was one of the problems with it.
So that the new and the experimental in terms of concert halls is probably not a very good idea.
Don't monkey with nature. That's really what it boils down to.
Have you ever played with a Philharmonic?
No. No. First of all, I don't hold a union card, and they would not permit it.
Not even for pleasure or in rehearsal?
No, I don't think so.
Dear me. Where do you prefer to sit in Philharmonic Hall?
Well, it depends on the particular program. If there's a piano on the stage, I like to sit along just to the along the left center aisle, so I have a good view of the keyboard, and not too far forward, because then you don't see the full panoply of the orchestra. But for a general performance, of an orchestral performance, say, anywhere back of the 10th row, shall we say, is fine. And particularly if you like the panorama, the view, sit on any of the tiers, first or second tier. I prefer the second tier. I like to get that high up and see it. Just like going to a musical show, if you're the mezzanine, you'll enjoy much more of that show than if you were in the 6th row orchestra seeing the people in front and nobody behind them at all. Same thing is true in orchestral performance.
Are there any auditoriums that are used only for one purpose? For example, Philharmonic, for what was formerly called Philharmonic Hall, is really the home of the New York Philharmonic, but they
Yes.
play many kinds of music, so that kind of hall must become an all-purpose musical environment. Doesn't that change the conditions?
Well, your question is a very excellent one. Let me answer it if I may. There are two types of halls, really, and this is regardless of size. One is intended for speech. A movie theater, for example. You want a minimum of reverberation there so that whatever comes off the screen is intelligible. The minute you start getting echoes in speech, intelligibility dies. So for movies, you want what we call a relatively dead hall. For music, you want the reverberation because the reverberation is the pepper and salt of music. You know, otherwise it's like listening to a violin through a rug. So that for music reproduction, you want a reverberant hall within limits, not too much. If you have too much reverberation, then it becomes, I would say, unpalatable. If I were to give you a ball of vanilla ice cream with a spoonful of chocolate syrup on it, well, that's one of the great delicacies of our time. But if I were to hand you, and if with the chocolate syrup representing reverberation, if I were to hand you a glass of chocolate syrup and ask you to drink it, you would back away, I'm sure. That's too much. In other words, you want the decay, what we call the decay time of the echo, not to be over-enthusiastic.
What's the origin of the term high fidelity, at least in terms of sound?
Well, fidelity, of course, you know, has many meanings. In sound, it means faithfulness to the original performance, the closest possible approach to what it sounded like when it was recorded, shall we say.
When did the term, though, high fidelity first come into use?
That began to be used in the middle 1930s, and it was used by people who were manufacturing the most miserable small radios, which of course didn't qualify for that term, but there was nobody to stop them. The Federal Trade Commission was not interested, so everything was called high fidelity. But I would say initially, any set that could reproduce tones up to 7,000 or 8,000 cycles in those days was called high fidelity, so-called high fidelity.
What was the first music machine that you manufactured?
The first one was a radio phonograph in 1937. It had what we call tuned radio frequency, broad tuning. In order to get those high frequencies, you had to have a broad tuner. It was designed for local reception only. You couldn't get anything beyond, say, 50 miles. And that made it possible to bring in a much wider audio spectrum than was the case on radios with very sharp tuning, designed to bring in very distant stations. You can't, in those days, you couldn't mix them both.
What's the most recent innovation?
Most recent innovation? Well, don't forget I've been retired for a few years now, but well, the most recent innovation in the industry has to be digital recording. That is, I'm pretty sure, going to dominate the techniques of recording.
What does that mean?
Do we have another hour and a half? Well, I'll give you a simple parallel that I think anybody can understand. When you make a master tape recording, you make copies from it from time to time, from which copies the production process ensues. Each time you make a copy from the master tape, it's like giving one quick lick of a lollipop. Theoretically, the lollipop is still there, but something came off it. Now, in digital recording, if I may give the analogy of a perforated piano roll, where you have little holes denoting the notes, as long as that paper is untorn, you can make as many, or you can have as many performances from it, or make as many copies from it, shall we say, as you wish. There's no, the 100th copy is just as good as the first copy. You lose nothing, and that is one of the great advantages of it.
It should revolutionize.
It has, and it does. They're already bringing out some digital recordings recorded digitally. The Japanese have now quite a selection of those records. Digital recording, there are different techniques involved, and of course there are several companies who want to wait and see whose system is finally adopted as the standard, because then, of course, they could start collecting royalties from their other friends in the industry. Now, I think you'll see it perhaps in 2 or 3 years.
Are you totally satisfied with Avery Fisher Hall now?
I am, I would say, in every possible respect, because I've heard all conceivable types of performances there from every spot in that hall, whether it's the uppermost balcony or sitting in a tier in the first, second tier box, or sitting in the orchestra. It doesn't matter where you sit because of those 3 components I told you. Whatever happens on that stage doesn't leak out. It stays in the hall until it loses all of its energy.
How often do you go?
Well, I go to 3 or 4 concerts a week, not all of them at Fisher Hall. I was at Carnegie Hall last night to hear a Russian violinist named Gidon Kramer, who was really one of the great ones. He was reviewed in today's Times, by the way, a rave review by Donald Hennahan. But we go to Chamber Music Society concerts. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the Marlborough Music Festival, and I go to their concerts when they're given. It's a variety. Last week we went to hear Victoria de Los Angeles at the 92nd Street Y, a really great lady.
And a really great institution as well.
Well, there's no question about it. A remarkable place.
There are all sorts of stereotypes that exist about musicians. One of the most recent that I've become aware of is about conductors, that among all occupations, they are the most longest lived, partially because of the ego gratification of their work and I guess a lifelong of exercise.
That's true. That's a very important component. They are, conducting an orchestra is a physical effort of dimensions that may escape the audience. But when you see that poor conductor leaving the podium at the end of a number and wiping his brow, he's not kidding. That's an exercise. Not all of them live to a ripe old age. Many of them do, it's true. But I don't think it has anything to do. I think it has to do more with who their parents were and how they spent their lives. If they kept their weight down and were engaged in orchestral conducting to a late, ripe age, they'll last almost forever. Look at There's a picture of Mr. Fiedler in today's times at the age of 84. He's had brain surgery, and there he is, right back again, conducting an orchestra.
In terms of the members, the musicians of an orchestra, in a recent book called The Psychology of Music, the author, Professor Davies, I believe his name is, quoted the stereotypes as he saw it, or at least as a clarinetist saw it, on other musicians. He analyzed in less than elegant terms that the brasses were the drinkers and the strings were the woodwinds were the thinkers. Is there a particular kind of stereotype of people of musicians that holds some merit, some validity?
Well, I would not be one to answer that question. I think, personally, I think it's a most difficult way to get through life. And that's true not only for members of a symphony orchestra who have a modicum of security, but it's true particularly of even the most successful of solo recitalists. They're constantly traveling. They spend half their lives or more. I know one of them spends something like 10 months a year away from New York, which is where he has his apartment. They wake up in strange hotels. They have meals in strange restaurants. They have the adulation. Of course, there is that compensation. And if you're good, the income is very substantial. There's no question about it.
Are you encouraged by the oncoming generation of musicians?
There are some marvelous ones coming up, no question about it. No question about it. More pianists than string players.
How do you explain that?
Always been that way. Well, I think there's a tendency to learn the basic king of instruments first, and some of them go on to a string instrument or to brass or woodwind. Others stay with the piano. If you want to be a pianist, you will face the most overwhelming competition, unless you're absolutely the best.
Well, you're constantly expanding your own horizons. What can we expect from you next?
Well, I've given up book designing, let's put it that way.
Well, you had a book very recently, just several years ago, the Edwin Way Teals book.
That's true.
And he's in the process of doing another book. Might you be tempted again?
I'm not doing a book because that's too much of a chore, but I am designing the program for the upcoming Gala benefit performance at the 92nd Street Y, which I think is May 14th. I'm doing that program. My wife is Janet is the chairman
of the benefit.
And I'm doing that. I enjoy doing a job that I can do in a few hours and get finished with it, but designing a book goes on for hours and days and weeks.
And we could go on for that amount of time too. Thank you very much, Avery Fisher. Thank you for coming and joining us, and thank you for enhancing the joy that is the Philharmonic experience. And thank you, audience, too.